in doing all of that, she has an emphasis in basically mentoring and supporting women entrepreneurs and women venture leaders. And she's also the founder of a wonderful program called Woven, which plays on the word woman, W-O-V-E-N. And I'm sure she's going to tell you more about that. What's most amazing about Nina, one little factoid that I know, is she actually went on a charity fundraising trip and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro this year doing that. So that's just really, truly amazing. And Odette Harris, I think, is familiar to many of you. She is a professor of neurosurgery here and the vice chair of diversity and director of brain injury in the Department of Neurosurgery. Odette and I served on the Stanford board together for a long time while she's being a neurosurgeon, while she's doing everything, and she just brings passion to all the stuff I do. When I run into her occasionally, I go into the gym, and Odette will be there working out, and she seems to even enjoy working out, so it's just truly amazing. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce them to stage, and they're going to have a little fireside chat on basically industry and Silicon Valley and how to be a woman in that part of the world.
Aww. And in case we don't get to it, I think we also need to acknowledge these shoes.
Thanks, Lila. Are our mics on? Yeah, okay. This is so fun. I've always wanted to be Oprah, so. What you guys don't know is Nina and I actually know each other. We're friends. We're both Aspen Fellows, Health Innovator Fellows. We're in the same cohort, and so we get to spend a lot of time together. So this is actually an incredible treat. So welcome back to Stanford.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm going to start actually by asking Nina, why in the world would you climb a mountain?
Oh gosh. I think I like to do things that are challenging. It was a little bit of a dare. A friend of mine who's a reporter, Luke Timmerman, wanted to do a trip raising money for the Fred Hutch Cancer Institute, and he called up and said, we're going to do this thing. I really think you should come. I've got Bob and Kent and Bill already signed up for it. And I said, oh, that's great. I'm pretty interested in doing something like this. I've always loved the outdoors, and I'm out near hiking, backcountry camping. But I said, I'm not going to go and be a girl on a dude trip. So it's not going to be Luke, Bob, Bill, and Kent and Nina. We'll do this only if we make it a 50-50 gender balanced group. And we ended up with 27 of us, which is a shockingly large number of people. 13 women, 14 men. We were 14 and 14, but one of the women tore her ACL before we ventured up. And 27 out of 27 summited, and we raised $1.7 million for basic research at the Hutch. So it was an incredibly rewarding trip.
Wow. So even breaking barriers on the mountain, making sure that it's gender
exactly
balanced.
Make it balanced, make it fair. Our world is not lopsided, so why should our expeditions and our work be?
Fantastic.
I have to point out that this is a gendered stage, because, or at least a different bodied design, because I can either have my feet on or lean back, but not both. So that's
I think we're both like under 5'3". I'm 5'2" and 3/4. So. So that was an interesting way to start. I want to go back though. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Tell us about your journey, to your current path. Like, just sort of help us to get to know you.
A little bit. Well, gosh, it's a long thread. I would say my childhood was both incredibly happy, fortunate, and privileged, and also really, really difficult and bumpy. I was born in Finland. My mother was Finnish. My father was Swedish. Their parents had actually met as young adults during the Second World War, and so my parents had met as children, but they discovered each other many, many years later and married. But their marriage didn't last, so I was separated from my mother when I was 5, moved with my sister and my dad to Sweden, and then ultimately to the States, where my dad remarried. My mother passed when I was 12, and my father remarried. And we moved a bunch of times through the Northeast. And in each of those environments, there was always a tremendous amount of love. There were friends, there were grandparents, there were nannies. My father was a complicated but really special person. But there was also a lot of loss and a lot of transition. And I think that's definitely something that defines my resilience and my drive and my eagerness in many ways to also give back, because I know what it's like in many ways to have to reinvent and replant and blend in time and time again, and also to recover from loss, one from accident, one from my father later passed from cancer. So that very much shaped me. But I was very privileged to go to great schools, have wonderful friends. Because of all the moving around, I actually sought application, was admitted to a boarding school like Dorica, and went to boarding school for high school, which was an extraordinary education. It was the first time that I appreciated that I was, by relative means, underprivileged, because I was surrounded by such tremendous wealth there. I had grown up without financial security, but at the same time with a lot of other creature comforts. And then from there came out to Stanford. And I would say throughout my childhood, the theme was both my parents were fortunate to be educated and to really prize and value education, reading, books, nature, and that was instilled in a very early age. And so most of the decisions that I made once I was able to make them autonomously was indexing towards challenge, towards education, curiosity, learning, and that I think has been my compass.
And how was your Stanford experience? What did you take from that in terms of the ability? Sorry. Oh, okay. Is that okay?
Maybe.
Can you guys hear us?
Yeah. Okay.
As we shift to your Stanford experience, can you sort of identify any barriers that you might have encountered during that, and how might the path that you've just described to Stanford, how did that shape your response to that?
I applied to a bunch of different schools, and I applied to Stanford for 2 reasons. I had never visited before I came. The brochure is beautiful, so the palm trees, and I mean, it's just stunning, blue sky weather. And the other was because it was 2,000 some miles away from home, and my high school years weren't the happiest family-wise. And so I think arriving here, I was really shocked, in part because I just had no idea what I'd chosen. And once I got that thick envelope that said I was admitted, it was obvious that you don't say no if you're admitted to Stanford. But I spent much of my freshman year writing transfer applications because it was so different. Everything I had rejected, the brick, the ivy, all of that I was longing for. The squirrels here were a different color and a different size. The trees didn't lose their foliage. I mean, it was just really all this mission architecture. It was just an odd duck. It's also a far, far bigger learning environment than I'd come from. All of my high school classes were taught around a round table with no more than 12 students. So particularly coming here and choosing to do some of the pre-med curricula, sitting in those huge survey rooms was a huge, huge adjustment. There's also such structure and formality to my high school years, and Stanford was much less structured. I had a dress code, so I thought it was strange that people would go to a class wearing sweatpants. The demography was also very, very different, just in terms of the student body, than where I was coming from, and that was a learning. But again, it was, you'd have to have your head in the sand not to find incredible stimulus and learning opportunity here. The curricula was just stunning, and the student exchange and push and the sense of competition and drive that came from just wanting to be better was awesome.
What was your Stanford major?
I did human biology. And I did about 2/3 of the pre-med requirements. I opted in there a little bit late, and I also didn't want to give up on a lot of the humanities classes that I really loved. I was really keen on ethics and policy, philosophy of science, so I dabbled a lot in that as well.
And what activities did you participate in? I'm just curious.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not much of a joiner. I was a runner, so that was a huge part. I was a student athlete through high school, but at this level, even like the club there's no way that little Nina was going to play club soccer at Stanford. So I ran a lot. I had got stress fractures in both my feet to prove it, because it turns out that's another thing that's different. When you run in the woods in the Northeast, it's soft and padded and moist. You run in the dish, and it's like brick, even if you're on the paths. So that, a lot of my I don't think I can think of really any clubs or groups, but I was extremely busy. I really took delicious advantage of lots of on-campus theater and music. I had a group that both wrote and performed poetry that I spent time with. We organized my junior year a women's collective that became a brown bag lunch group, and some of the women from that are my best friends still. So it's a little bit more, and I took everything that you could take as an undergraduate at the medical school. So I also spent a lot of time over there. I worked much of my time. I worked anywhere from 20 to 30 hours a week through all 4 years here at a OBGYN practice, as well as a couple of different lab jobs. I TA'd a whole bunch. Wow. So I kind of filled my schedule with that kind of stuff.
Very busy. I don't know if there are any undergraduates in the room, but I recently spent some time on another undergraduate institution, campus talking to their undergraduates. And one of the things that I was reminded of is how stressful it is, like when you're an undergraduate at a high elite school or whatever term you want to apply to places like Stanford and the Ivy League, the stress coming out. For example, one of the things they talked about was the expected starting salary for kids coming out of places like Stanford and Harvard and Dartmouth, and then the reality of what they actually do make and how that impacts people coming out. But what I took away from that was sort of the burden that a lot of these kids have while they're in school trying to figure out what they want to do. So as you embarked on like leaving Stanford, embarking into your life, like, do you recall what kind of stressors you felt in the expectations of having spent, the last 4 years?
I think my biggest stressors were that I had to right away earn an income. I had massive amounts of student debt and didn't have any family resources to fall back on, so I had to get a job. And in fact, I had a job by March of my senior year that I started September after I came back did another great trip after I graduated on the Appalachian Trail. So that was one. I knew, as I have always known and still know to my absolute core, that it had to be in healthcare. Something in health science, something in science, medicine, healthcare service, fairly agnostic. And I don't think I had a consciousness about what I needed to earn or that I was thinking about wealth accumulation in any way. It was really just about, these are my monthly bills and I have to clear that. And then the ante upped a little bit because my dad became ill and couldn't really support himself financially. And so then it was sort of, I need to support me plus be able to be helpful to him. And I graduated thinking I was going to go to medical school. I hadn't finished all my pre-med requirements. I planned to do that at night school while working. Didn't quite plan out. It became that plan deferred each year. But that was sort of my organizing principles. At some point, I was going to go to medical school and become a doctor.
So then take us through your path from there to your current career. Like, what were some of the key defining moments and choices that you made?
Gosh, I'm not sure I think about it as so much as like key defining choices, as much as sort of happy coincidences. My first job was a very deliberate one. I had volunteered and then got a paid job while I was an undergrad for the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is up on Sand Hill Road. Ironic that I've just not been able to get myself off Sand Hill Road my whole career. I just keep crossing the street to different firms. But that was a health policy think tank that had extraordinary leadership. The CEO, Drew Altman, CEO still, was an incredibly compelling person, and they had a vision of providing policy research and public opinion polling to help inform public discourse and policy making in healthcare, and that was so up my alley. And that was an incredibly gratifying job. And then I wanted to move to the East Coast. I had a college boyfriend who was in medical school at Columbia, and my dad back east, not doing so well health-wise, so I wanted to move east. And I just needed a job in New York that paid rent, and it was $99 in Manhattan, so that was a fairly, high hurdle to clear. And quite honestly, it was the strength of my network and my privileged education that my second job was not a deliberate choice. It was a really lucky favor to somebody else, and it just happened to be a match. I was hired at a hedge fund working for a physician, an MD, PhD transplanter who'd been in industry and had just joined there, and she needed somebody to be her sort of gopher. And I was as good a gopher candidate as anybody that happened to present that day, and I got a super, super lucky break that changed the course of my career. So that was healthcare hedge fund, ultimately made my way back to California working for a small merchant bank, and then transitioned full-time into venture capital, which I've been doing now for almost 20 years. Wow. On Sand Hill Road. One firm on the right and the other on the left.
And about your choice in venture capitalists, can you tell us maybe what has been the most challenging aspect of that role, or those roles?
I've been incredibly, incredibly lucky, and I would say that in my trajectory, my experience has been perhaps, and not anymore, but perhaps more ageism than sexism, because it's been a new industry. At the early stage venture, it's also very much a meritocracy, and perhaps I was just lucky or oblivious, but I didn't feel the weight of the deplorable statistics. In private equity, women comprise less than 15% overall and less than 7% in leadership or senior check writing capacity. So it's really, really upside down. And changing that is definitely a challenge. We're doing better now. The numbers are higher in in all of the healthcare industries, but still in leadership, whether it's academic medicine or pharmaceutical companies or private equity, we're still really low. And for an industry, particularly private equity for healthcare, that is facing a customer marketplace where women are far more than 50% of the labor force, marshal far more than 75% of the dollars and decisions, it's just unforgivable that those that are investing in the innovation that will serve those patients and those decision makers are so ill-representative of their constituents, so to speak. So that's certainly one challenge that I continue to rattle against. And once we go beyond women and talk to people of color, the numbers are, I mean, you need a microscope. The other really, really big challenge is fundamentally early stage investing is a really risky business. It is as much driven by luck and timing and context as it is by the wisdom of anyone like me picking this company or that company, this entrepreneur or that entrepreneur. And that is scary. It means you really can never feel comfortable resting on your laurels. It also means you deal with a lot of egos that have been lofted by luck and not necessarily by skill, but are nonetheless the BFDs in the firm or in the industry. And that's a challenge to reckon with as well. It breeds a certain flavor of insecurity at the same time that it also breeds incredible stimulus, incredible financial rewards, incredible adventure. To be on the bleeding edge of science and medicine is, the luckiest thing I can think of.
Is there a particular experience or moment that you might have had in making a decision about a company where you felt like your unique perspective at the table had to be wielded, like you had to say, this is something that I'm going to stand up for, recognizing that your voice is probably the minority in the room?
That's a good question. I made an investment last year in a really innovative cell therapy company. It's a company that uses a software algorithm on tumor sequence to predict neoantigens that might be most triggering of an anti-cancer immune response, and then amplify that by editing those TCRs into the patient's own T cells. It's the type of science that is transformative but really challenging to translate. It's the type of investment that will spend $5 to $6 on manufacturing for every dollar spent on research or clinical translation. Mm-hmm. In antibodies, we think about that being $2 in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. Here it's $5, $7, $10. So it's very, very capital intense. And that was not really consistent with our model at my current firm. And I really stuck my neck out for that because I feel like it's an incredible opportunity. I think there's a chance for it to make a great investment, but I also think it represents the next wave of science, and that we as early stage risk takers and pushers of the envelope need to be in. And I hardly sleep at night because I've got this target on my back for having lobbied an investment that was controversial. But more than that, I find the places where I, uniquely Nina, champion my values or beliefs towards a change in behavior or change in action is around people stuff, about how to comprise a board, how to comprise a C-suite, when to make a management change, how to hire and promote within our own firm. And that's probably where I use most of my political capital. And bringing that unique perspective that is not there usually at the boardroom. Yeah, and sort of calling things as I see them, which, to apropos of the earlier discussion, I think, the strong, ambitious, tough that describes a male when it's levered against a woman is often derogatory. And I've had phrases such as, you're so direct. Leveled at me as opposed to indirect, right? It's like, would you like me to be sheepish and coy? You're so direct. No, just kidding. So tell us how Woven came about and how you envision it in maybe addressing some of the barriers that you just described in the upside down nature of the composition of the rooms that you're in, et cetera. What is your vision for Woven? And maybe take a couple sentences to actually tell the group who might not be familiar with Woven. So Woven stands for Women Who Venture, and it's sort of an umbrella that I put around a bunch of different initiatives that I'd been involved in either as catalyst or participant to convene women, to celebrate women and their accomplishments, to also have some of those huddles about, I got it how you're a super successful neurosurgeon, but
where did you get your shoes, and what are your life hacks? How do you smile at the gym at 5 o'clock in the morning? I mean, how do you do you in ways that are inspiring? A couple of the features of the platform, we have a dinner for women in venture capital at the big healthcare conference in January every year at JP Morgan. Started with half a dozen of us getting together to bitch, and now it's 150 women strong, and we get together to convene and also have a speaker, much like you've done. We do some various salons on topical things, how to negotiate for yourself and your best salary, or how to lead difficult conversations in teams, et cetera. And those tend to be smaller format. And then, because often when I would do a little speaking engagement or a panel, I would find someone waiting to talk afterwards, saying, sort of on the point about how you do you, can you tell me about family life and how do you juggle your schedule, or do you have a fitness routine? Things that are part of the enterprise of being an effective and functioning person. And it made me realize that we don't talk enough about that, and we don't celebrate enough that, and that women also are uncomfortable touting their horn. The number of times I interview a woman for a position and she's underselling herself or making caveats is so striking to me. The the rare occasion of hearing a young woman say, I want to be a CEO. I feel like in the Valley, every young teenage boy says, I'm going to be a CEO, or VC, or a professional athlete, and women say, I might be a COO or chief marketing officer, and we need to change that rhetoric. So I conceived of a podcast interview format, kind of like we're talking here, to get at exactly those issues. What's your story? What drives you? How do you juggle it all? And to help women sort of toot their own horn by asking them, forcing them to talk about themselves.
And interestingly enough, it doesn't just apply to venture. It applies to women in almost every category of life.
Not at all, yeah. We've had a cupcake entrepreneur, we've had a surgeon, we've had an executive coach, we've had a CEO, we've had a dancer. So, yeah, it's women who venture. Venturing is about, having moxie and having a dream and chasing it.
Yeah. Did you get free cupcakes, or?
No, but I did go to Las Vegas last week. Don't ask why. But leaving the airport, I saw that her cupcake company has a cupcake ATM. That was one of her big innovations, and the Las Vegas airport has a Sprinkles cupcake ATM.
That's pretty cool. Wow, something that I wish I could do, but I have nothing to put in the ATM. But it would be very, very awesome.
One of my favorite phrases, and we saw this actually when we were last in our fellowship down in Greenville, South Carolina, there was a sign in a window that says, a gathering without cake is just a meeting.
Yes, yeah. Fully agreed. So you, on your way to the last time we saw each other, you were dropping off a kid at college.
Oh, here come the tears.
Yeah, what a moment. Both to be celebrated and also just like to pause, right? Just such an incredible...
Yeah, I'm so lucky because I'm her stepmom. She's 18 and just started as a freshman at Tufts. And I rode through most of the high school years as one of her BFFs and cheerleaders, and got to see her every other weekend, typically at her best. Her dear poor mother got to see all of the heartache and hair pulled out applying to college, and the late nights and the all-nighters and the mood swings and so forth. But yeah, it's a huge transition for us as a family. I couldn't be happier for her. She's thriving and worrying and learning. She sent me a text the other day that says, I hate Scantron, because she'd never taken bubble tests in high school. So she's hacking her way through. But it's beautiful to see, and as anyone with kids can attest, and you with your girls, it's just such an incredible privilege to sort of revisit your own childhood, and then also to see the world as it's seen through a 7-year-old, a 12-year-old, an 18-year-old, and it gives me such hope.
Yeah.
Meeting her friends at school and seeing what they're up to, because I think the world needs them.
But so we started this conversation with, or parts of it with, on the precipice of your Stanford journey, college journey, and she's now right there. What's changed? What do you think what barriers do you think that you might have experienced that she might not? And on the converse, like what barriers are new for her that you might not have experienced?
That's a really, really great question. I'm going to turn it back to you about
Again,
your
I
girls.
am Oprah, so no, just kidding.
I think she and her cohort face a level of expectation stress. You alluded to this a little bit. Not just ambition for what will be my graduating salary, but just expectation stress. I mean, she is really, really worried that the first B- that she's gotten in her life, which she got on her biology midterm, she'd kill me if I broadcast that. Shh.
So don't live stream this.
No live streaming this. She is convinced that that will have an impact on whether or not she'll be admitted into medical school if she wants to go. And so that level of stress and the brand stress around applying to the right college, and she really wanted to go to Brown. She applied early decision. First wave there was deferred, and she's a very practical STEM kid, did some math and said, my odds are so much better if I apply ED2 to Tufts, but I'll never know if I would have possibly gotten into Brown, and will people respect me less because Tufts is not Brown, and people on the West Coast haven't heard of Tufts. All this agita, I think, it's not that I didn't experience it, but I just feel like it's level 10 now. And on the other hand, I think the fact that she is a self-declared STEM student as a girl is an easier thing, I think, than it was to be declaring that, 20 years ago.
What advice do you give her?
I'm mixed about this. I'd love to take a poll in the room. I mean, I give her advice to try to really be gentle on herself. I try to be the voice of self-care, and I try to help her hold that stress and not to try to trivialize it or to fix it, but also to try to help her move past it and not spiral. On the other hand, it's a super competitive world, just like applying to college. There were so many more applicants for her spot at Tufts than there would have been for me at the same time when I applied. So some of the realities of those stresses are just that real.
Yeah, I do think it's a different world, but I'm not sure it's better per se. Lots more stress for them. When we were last together, one of the discussions that we had was the fact that there are a lot of things that we're doing as a society, we're all engaged in, that through our lens, we look back at the previous generations and we say, oh my gosh, they got that totally wrong, right? And there are endless examples of things that we're judging now today through our knowledge and saying, gosh, what were they thinking? So now that you've sent someone off to college and they're going to be in a position in 20 years to look back on us, what do you think they will think that we got wrong? Like things that we engage in constantly. What will they think that we are not addressing? What barriers are we not dealing with that they're going to suffer the consequences of?
I don't think I can give any answer other than climate change and the health of our planet. The list, I think, of what we're screwing up is very, very long, but that's the one that is going to have such profoundly disproportionate impacts on them and their children relative to us. And as God bless, we've been fine with the fires, but we've been without power 3 times in the last couple of months. I live up in Sausalito. We've hosted evacuees who haven't been fine, who've lost property or homes. We've helped people evacuate animals and family. That is a consequence of what we're doing to the climate, and we're bracing for it as a new normal, and I'm just bracing for the inconvenience of needing to get a generator, most likely, but they will be living, I think, a very different world.
Yeah. It's sort of stemming from that question. There's a story that we read together, which is haunting. It's called the Omelas. I can't remember the Omelas.
Yeah, Omelas.
The exact title, but it's a haunting.
It's Barbara Le Guin, a great science fiction writer.
Yeah. Wait, who's the author?
I'm sorry, Ursula Le Guin.
Ursula Le Guin. And has anyone in the audience read that story, Omelas? I'm going to butcher the story, but it's a story about a town that's blissful, wonderful, everything is fantastic, like Palo Alto. And at some point, all the members of the society or the town realize that there is a child in the basement of a building in the town who is chained in this basement. And the child being chained is what is the source of their happiness. If the child is let free, they will no longer be happy. And at some point, they all have to make a decision that they're okay with the sacrifice of this child, this one child in the basement being chained. And every so often, somebody's not okay with it, and they leave the town. But most people are aware of it, and they just don't think about the child in the basement. It's a haunting story. I'm obviously not a gifted science fiction writer, so I can't tell you all the nuances of it. But one of the things that is most haunting about the story is thinking about what are we holding in terms of barriers? What are we holding in the basement? What do you think we're holding in the basement as a society that's allowing us to be happy, that we are looking the other direction on and sort of ignoring and yet moving on in Palo Alto?
I mean, I think we're holding the reliance of our comfort and satisfaction on the income disparity and the racial inequity that we have in this country. I don't think the institutions of our great comfort could survive without having had that history and without relying on that inequity today. It's something that I feel ashamed about. It's something that I feel hypocritical about, being in the business of bringing expensive leading-edge medicines to market, knowing that there will be a profound inequity about who will receive those medicines because of cost. And I think in the case of healthcare, and particularly, we have crafted a system here where it is predicated on inequity. The moral and ethical framework that defines U.S. healthcare system is equity, individualism, so long as you can afford it. And of course, we also know that healthcare epidemiology is a consequence of what you can and cannot afford in terms of preventive health, nutrition, activity, stress management. So that is the Omelas child in the basement that I'm not walking away from.
Yeah, and you asked me a question once, which sort of simplifies this: is if you had a magic wand, what would you do differently, if anything? Like, do you think there's a magic bullet to solving this?
I don't believe in magic bullets. That's probably when someone asks me what's the biggest difference between your 20s and today, I feel like, I live in the 60-40. It's
I'm
great
still
odds.
in the 20s.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. So let me share my wisdom from my vantage point. I think the wands that I would wave is I do think I would advocate tax reform, universal basic income, and a total redistribution of investment from military defense to the education system in the U.S.
Wow, that's powerful. Yeah. So I think we're close to the end, and so one of the things that Woven does in their interview format is they do this sort of rapid fire part where they just ask a bunch of really fun questions that everyone needs to know, like, where'd you get your shoes, kind of a thing. But so I'm going to throw a few at you. If you weren't, if this weren't your career, what would you do?
I still really wish I were a physician.
Never too late.
The other thing that I noticed that, I don't know if Derica is still here, but I noticed in her bio that she, I think, has a divinity degree or took a degree from a Consciousness Institute. Chaplaincy, rabbi,
I would definitely do that.
universalist, something in that vein. I think I'd also really enjoy.
Oh, I would so
a service
do that.
job.
Yeah, I would so do that. I would definitely do theology or something. I think I've told you that I wanted to be Hasidic Jew, and when I was in high school.
You have definitely not told me that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was a huge fan of Chaim Potok. I don't know if anyone here has read The Chosen and all those books. And for some reason, I thought I could be Hasidic Jew. What was most incredible about that is that my dad did not tell me that I couldn't be Hasidic Jew. And so we would drive through Brooklyn, and I would look out the window in complete awe. And anyway, so that's what I wrote my college essay about, how I wanted to be. And it wasn't flippant. I truly thought it was a possibility at 14. It's not. by the way. But I would study theology as well. It's cool. Anyway, so what's your superpower?
I think my superpower is connecting, and I think it's connecting dots. I think I have a pretty synthetic mind intellectually, but I also think it's connecting people. I certainly think that's the gift that serves me the most in my work and in my life.
Yeah, very good. What personality trait or quality would you ditch if you could and get rid of?
So many.
Tell us three.
Second guessing and insecurity. I would love to know what it feels like. I think every human would, but what it would feel like to not carry so much white noise of self-doubt. I have another trait which I know is a gift, but it's also a liability, which is I tend to say yes, and I'm trying to learn to say yes more judiciously, to see what it would feel like to say no before I come around to the yes, because it leads to overcommitment and overfunctioning, and I don't handle that stress well.
These are questions you've asked me before. Do you have an exercise routine?
I do, but again, routine is a terrible word. I exercise, not routinely, sporadically. Do you remember that Brittany Murphy? I think it was in Clueless. She sporadically isn't landed like dead. Look up Clueless, Brittany Murphy, of blessed memory. I exercise sporadically. I love being active. I love hiking. I love cycling. I work out once a week with a trainer, yoga, Pilates. I use a lot of apps for that.
And do you have a spiritual or a mindfulness routine?
Again, that routine word. I need to change the questions when I do this. Discuss mindfulness, discuss spirituality. I'm Jewish by conversion, but I also think genetically the values have been so ingrained in me long before I converted. And we observe those major holidays and observe Shabbat even if it's just to light a candle at home. I find nature incredibly meditative, so that is probably my biggest sure thing for mindfulness, if I can get myself out to nature.
And what is your favorite book, television, or movie, or one of each?
These days I'm actually obsessing on podcasts. There's one called Stay Tuned by Preet Bharara, who's a former U.S. District Attorney or U.S. prosecutor who's incredibly erudite and has fabulous guests. Highly left-leaning, so it also is, my media consumption that validates my own belief system. I absolutely loved the Elena Ferrante books, My Brilliant Friend and so on, the Neapolitan Chronicles, some of the best writing in a long, long time. Yeah, that's probably a good start. Mm-hmm. And The Wire is probably my all-time favorite television series.
Oh, intense.
Intense, but so good. The acting is phenomenal, and the storylines are so rich and complex.
And my last rapid-fire question is, what's your favorite life hack?
I got a bunch of life hacks. The podcast is one. I have earbuds in and listen to content whenever I'm moving through the world because it helps keep me less lame. Navy and black goes with everything. Packs well, easy to coordinate. Most people look good in that. Almost all of my beauty products are like double function. So I use like a moisturizer with sunscreen that's tinted. I use a shampoo conditioner combination in one step. I use mascara that can also be a brow gel. So wherever I can get double or triple duty.
Great advice. And what didn't I ask that you would want to share?
I feel like I did an awful lot of talking.
Did I cover all the bases?
You should have asked, now will you ask me some questions?
No. My last question will be, what brings you joy?
This brings me joy. I mean, this room full of talented, driven, accomplished women and select men is an incredible place to spend a few hours this morning. Getting to connect with a person that I adore in this kind of intimate public way is really cool. I've loved doing the Woven podcast so much. It's such a privilege to celebrate other people. It's like a gratitude practice on steroids. And then, as we said before, being active and being in nature.
Yeah, this has been so much fun. I can't believe I got this experience in interviewing Nina. She's just an amazing woman. Thank you for taking the time and allowing me to do this. And I ask you guys to join me in thanking her, and then we'll open up to any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
So much fun. I know, it's pretty right.
Hi, so we're in like lean-in territory, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
what
Are
did
we?
you- I mean, I don't know.
Silicon Valley.
I was like, I'm going to lean in, and then I'm not going to lean in. So what do you think about when people ask you, I mean, can women have it all? Can they have it all except at different times? Are we supposed to lean in? So, I mean, what's your perspective on that?
It's a really important question, and I am editing myself from being judgmental about lean in movement specifically, because I think there is so much good that's come out of it, even though I also have some opinions about it. For me, what lean in really means is try to know who I am and try to be my authentic self in as many environments of my life as I can be, and figure out what's really most important to me. Because I think this idea of having it all and having balance is such a tricky game. I try to celebrate the small wins. If I cook dinner one night a week, and I cook dinner because I find joy in doing that, but it's really hard to coordinate, that feels to me like a win, because I think of myself as someone who loves people through cooking and feeding them, and also love the sensuality of cooking when I spend so much of my time in my head, and not ask, are we always having home-cooked dinner? And I am giving my husband terribly short change here, because he's actually a phenomenal cook, and he puts food on the table way more often than I do. But I think of it more of as an example of I could choose to beat myself up for that, or I could try to do triple backflips, and instead I feel like there are other things that are more important to me. Seeing a friend for an hour after work can mean so much more than whether or not I got dinner on the table that evening versus takeout. So I think leaning in is self-affirmation and self-advocacy, and I think a huge part of leaning in is also when you are in positions of influence and rule setting, to try to create the most inclusive, diverse, and embracing environments that you can, for not just for women, but for everybody. When you have the opportunity, and sometimes it's not because you're the boss, sometimes it's because you're the bright rising star who people are energized by, but to take those opportunities and make the environments better for everybody.
I have a question about, you're in the midst of venture capital and other kinds of work in the Silicon Valley, and more of our bioscience graduates are not going into the academic route. They're going into private companies and industry. And of course, we're here in the Silicon Valley that doesn't have a very good reputation about supporting women in many of the industries that are here in Silicon Valley. So can you address a little bit about you as a woman going into the world of startups and high techs and whether that's a place for women or still being blocked? Are there still barriers?
I feel, and maybe my lens is so disproportionate to looking into academic life sciences versus broader sort of life science context, but I feel like there is more inclusivity and more opportunity for women in industry than there is in a lot of the scientific disciplines within academia, that the ceilings are breaking a little bit faster in leaderships in the corporate world than they are in the chairmanships and the leadership of chemistry departments or different medical disciplines. It doesn't mean that bias and underrepresentation aren't rife in both, but I think there is a bit more meritocracy, and I think industry, particularly in Silicon Valley, and life science, I think, does a much better job than hard science and tech, AI. But I think there is more agitation by the workforce for diverse and inclusive environments, and than there is comfortably within the hallowed ivory towers of of academia? I don't mean to be glib about the answer, but I feel like that the waves of change are happening faster, especially in sort of, small to mid-sized companies.
There was a question over here. She's a neurosurgeon.
Thank you for sharing so much information about yourself and for the wonderful questions. I wanted to ask you, how can we be the mentors and the sponsors for the next generation better than we are now? Because I hear from so many young women the challenges they face in college and finding opportunities, but I don't really know how to guide them. And I think we could do better. So I just would love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about is, my own experience when I was here. Genentech, Affymetrix, Chiron, these companies were founded in the backyard here, and I had no idea about them as an undergraduate. The only thing with a human biology or pre-med, if you weren't going straight to graduate school, the only things you did were go to management consulting with those backgrounds. So I'm curious whether or not there's more socialization and job fairs and more industry and startups leaning into the university today. I think on the opportunities for young women in particular, I'm have three thoughts. One is, of course, we as women in whichever walks we are, try to particularly be available to those young women who ask for advice. I think helping them to seek mentoring better by asking that they really frame their ambitions and their questions and make good use of whatever 30 minutes or hour that you give is also important. It makes a bidirectional accountability. And then I think it's really important that we as women are not the only people that are mentoring these younger girls. We need to join men in that business. They have tenfold the number of positions of influence statistically. And so we need to show the merits to them of having a diverse workforce and adding to that creativity and that cognitive diversity in their organizations. So figure out how to enjoin and matchmake those. Not just say, I'm happy to meet with you, but I think it would be much better for you to meet with my colleague, Rafe or Rich.
So I just want to say another big thank you for Nina.
Thank you for having me.
And
Such a
Odette
privilege.
for from the Child in the Basement and also to the Magic Wand. I think I certainly leave this session with a lot to think about, both by myself and in discussions with my family, probably at dinner tonight. So anyway, let's just give them another round of big applause and thank you. Thank you, Phil. So thank you so much.
I thought I would leave.